Fleetwood Mac went through more chaos than most bands could survive: breakups, affairs, meltdowns, lineup changes, and somehow the music never stopped landing. These are their 10 best-selling songs, and everyone has a story behind it. Let's get into it. 10. Everywhere. This song came out in 1987 as part of the Tango in the Night album, which turned out to be the last record Fleetwood Mac made with their classic lineup before everything fell apart again. Lindsey Buckingham was already mentally checked out of the band. By this point, he would refuse to tour behind the album. And his departure triggered yet another painful restructuring that the band somehow survived. Christine McVie wrote Everywhere during a period of genuine personal contentment, which was rare enough inside the Fleetwood Mac story that it practically qualifies as a historical anomaly. The lightness in the song is real because the feeling behind it was real, and audiences responded to that authenticity immediately. It became a top 10 hit on both sides of the Atlantic and has since accumulated streaming numbers that dwarf its original chart performance, finding entirely new audiences decades after its release. McVie had a gift for writing warmth without sentimentality, and this song is the purest expression of that gift in the entire catalog. Uncomplicated in the best possible sense, arriving inside an album full of tension like a window somebody left open. A song written in happiness by a band surrounded by chaos is its own kind of miracle, and the audience has always been able to feel the difference. 9. The Chain. This is the only Fleetwood Mac song that carries a writing credit from every single member of the band, which tells you something important about how it came together, not as a unified creative vision, but as a collision of fragments that somehow formed something greater than any of them intended. The famous bass line that closes the song was essentially salvaged from a separate piece of music and grafted onto the track during the Rumors sessions, which were themselves held together by professional discipline while the personal relationships inside the band were disintegrating in real time. Mick Fleetwood has described those sessions as the most emotionally exhausting period of his professional life. And the tension is audible in every note of this song. It became one of the defining tracks of the entire Rumors era, and its second life, as the Formula One theme introduced it to an entirely new generation who had no idea what they were connecting with. The lyric, "If you don't love me now, you will never love me again," lands differently when you know it was written by people who were actively losing each other while sitting in the same room. That specific emotional weight is what separates it from every other song on the album, and audiences have been responding to it without fully understanding why for nearly 50 years. 8. Little Lies. Christine McVie wrote this one during the same Tango in the Night sessions that produced Everywhere, and the contrast between the two songs tells you a great deal about her range as a writer. Where Everywhere was open and warm, Little Lies is built on a kind of sophisticated self-deception, the narrator asking to be lied to because the truth is too difficult to live inside. McVie has spoken about writing from emotional situations she had either lived through or observed closely, and the specificity of the feeling in this lyric suggests she knew exactly what she was describing. The production, handled largely by Buckingham, wrapped the song in a polished sheen that became the defining sound of late-period Fleetwood Mac. It reached #1 in the UK and performed strongly across Europe, adding significantly to an album that was already tracking toward massive commercial success despite the internal tension surrounding it. What makes Little Lies hold up across decades is that the emotional logic at its center is completely universal. The gap between what we know to be true and what we wish were true is something every listener has lived inside at some point, and McVie articulated it with a directness that bypasses every defense you might otherwise put up. The production sounds dated in the best possible way, which only adds to its charm. If you're enjoying this one, hit subscribe before you forget we cover stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. 7. Landslide. Stevie Nicks wrote this in 1974. While staying in Aspen, Colorado. At a genuine crossroads in her life, She and Buckingham were about to either join Fleetwood Mac or abandon music entirely.
Till the landslide brought me down.
And return to conventional employment. She was 26 years old, standing at the foot of a mountain she had been climbing for years without knowing whether the summit existed, and the song came directly from that specific uncertainty. It didn't become a significant commercial hit on its original release, but its life in the decades since has been extraordinarily covered hundreds of times, used in films and television with a frequency that speaks to how universally the core feeling translates. It was eventually certified platinum on the strength of accumulated sales long after its initial release, and the Smashing Pumpkins version introduced it to an entirely new generation in the 90s, who then went back and found the original. There is something about the central image, looking at your reflection in the snow-covered hills and asking whether you can handle the seasons of your life, that seems to find people at exactly the moments when they need it most, which is why the song keeps accumulating new listeners rather than fading. Nix wrote it in one sitting at 26 years old, and it will outlast almost everything else she ever made. 6. Sara. This is one of the most emotionally layered songs in the entire Fleetwood Mac catalog, and the layers only become visible when you know the circumstances behind it. Nix has given different accounts of who or what Sara refers to over the years at various points, suggesting it was about her relationship with Mick Fleetwood, about a close friend, and about a pregnancy she chose not to continue during the Tusk sessions. The song runs to over 6 minutes in its album version, which was commercially unusual for the era, and the label pushed hard for significant cuts that Nix resisted with a determination that speaks to how personally important the material was to her. It was released as a single in edited form and reached the top 5 in America, but the full version is the one that carries the real emotional weight, the extended instrumental passages, giving the song a meditative quality that the edited version can only gesture toward. Songs this personal and this unresolved don't usually become hits, which makes the commercial success of Sara a genuinely unusual thing in pop music history. The audience responded to something they couldn't fully name, which is usually the mark of a song operating at a level beyond what its surface details can explain. 5. Big Love. This one belongs almost entirely to Lindsey Buckingham, who wrote, performed, and produced it as a showcase for a finger-picking guitar technique he had been developing for years.
In that house on the hill, looking out for love.
The Tango in the Night album was in many ways Buckingham's production statement, The Record, where he demonstrated what he could do with a studio as an instrument, and Big Love was the most concentrated expression of that ambition. The layered guitar parts were recorded separately and assembled into something that sounded almost orchestral, despite being essentially one man and one instrument, which is the kind of technical achievement that gets more impressive the more you understand what was actually being attempted. Lyrically, it sits in the complicated emotional territory that Buckingham occupied throughout his career, desire and frustration, and the particular tension of wanting something you can't quite reach. It reached the top 10 on both sides of the Atlantic and became one of the most recognizable guitar showcases of the late 80s, cementing Buckingham's reputation as one of the most distinctive producers of his generation. The live solo version he performed in later years stripped the studio production away entirely and revealed just how complete the original guitar architecture was. The song didn't need anything else around it, which is a remarkable thing to discover about a record that already sounded finished. 4. Gold Dust Woman. Stevie Nicks wrote this during the Rumors sessions as a direct account of what cocaine addiction looked like from the inside, dressed in the kind of witchy, metaphorical language that became her signature, the rock queen imagery, the references to dragons and pale shadows. It's all a very deliberate covering of something extremely raw and specific, with a layer of mythology that made it easier to say out loud.
Rock on, gold dust woman. Take your silver spoon.
Nicks has been open in interviews about the fact that she was describing her own experience, and that honesty retroactively sharpens every image in the song into something considerably harder than the mystical surface suggests. The recording captures a band at the absolute peak of their creative chemistry, even as their personal relationships were in freefall, which is the central contradiction of the entire Rumors era, condensed into one track. Christine McVie's keyboard work underneath the vocal gives the song a cold, almost ceremonial quality that perfectly matches the subject matter addiction dressed up as ritual, destruction dressed up as power. It has become one of the most streamed songs in the catalog across successive generations of listeners who keep finding their way back to it, each generation apparently needing its own version of what Nicks was describing. 3. Go Your Own Way. Lindsey Buckingham wrote this about Stevie Nicks while they were still in the same band, still performing together every night, still having to stand on the same stage and play the same songs. While the relationship between them was actively disintegrating. He has acknowledged in interviews that some of the lyrical accusations in the song were not entirely fair, which is a remarkable thing to admit about a record that has sold tens of millions of copies. Nicks has said she hated the specific lines she felt misrepresented her, and hated having to sing backing vocals on a song describing her that way, but the professional machinery of the Rumors album was more powerful than either of their personal objections. It became the lead single from one of the best-selling albums in history, and its opening guitar figure is among the most recognizable in rock music. The drumming on the track was a deliberate choice by Buckingham that Mick Fleetwood initially pushed back on. The pattern was unconventional for the era, and Buckingham had to argue for it specifically, which is the kind of detail that reminds you how many small battles go into making something sound inevitable. The tension that made it almost unbearable to record is exactly what makes it impossible to stop listening to, and that equation has held for nearly 50 years without showing any signs of weakening. 2. Don't Stop. Fleetwood Mac recorded this during the Rumors sessions as Christine McVie's most direct and commercially accessible statement on the album. It was written about optimism and forward momentum at a moment when optimism inside the band required genuine effort to locate, which gives the song a complexity beneath its bright surface.
Thinking about tomorrow, don't stop, it'll soon be here.
That most casual listeners never consciously register, but always seem to feel. The call and response vocal arrangement between McVie and Buckingham gave it an energy that translated immediately to radio, and it became one of the album's defining singles despite the personal circumstances, making it almost ironic to record. Bill Clinton used it as his 1992 presidential campaign anthem, which introduced it to an audience of tens of millions who had never engaged with Fleetwood Mac as a serious musical proposition, and the exposure translated directly into a commercial resurgence that the band hadn't anticipated. It returned to the charts, drove significant back catalog sales, and became permanently associated with a cultural moment far beyond the one it was originally made for. McVie wrote a song about not dwelling on the past, and the past is exactly what kept making it relevant, which is the kind of beautiful irony that only reveals itself across decades. 1. Dreams. Stevie Nicks wrote this in the studio in about 10 minutes, sitting alone in a room that had been set up for her with a keyboard and a pair of headphones, and what came out became the only Fleetwood Mac single.
Dreams you'd like to sell, dreams as lonely
To ever reach #1 in the United States. She has described the writing process as almost automatic, the song arriving fully formed in a single sitting while the rest of the band worked elsewhere in the building. The Rumors context matters enormously here because Dreams is Nicks's side of the Buckingham breakup told, with a composure and a restraint that makes it more devastating than any amount of direct accusation could have managed. Then in 2020, a TikTok video of a man skateboarding while drinking cranberry juice sent the song back to #1 on the streaming charts 43 years after its original release, which is a commercial phenomenon with almost no precedent in music history. Nathan Apodaca filmed himself on a highway in Idaho and accidentally gave one of the greatest songs ever recorded its second cultural life, introducing it to an audience that had no personal memory of the Rumors era and responded to it with the same instinctive recognition that the original audience had In 1977, a song written in 10 minutes became one of the most enduring pieces of pop music ever recorded, and it somehow found a way to be new again almost half a century later. Fleetwood Mac should not have survived everything they put themselves through, and the fact that the music did survive is the most extraordinary part of the whole story. Every song on this list was made inside some form of chaos, and every one of them sounds like it wasn't. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.